Hello, everyone. Today, I would like to share a story that revolves around one of the most tragic maritime incidents in recent history, known worldwide as the Sewol ferry disaster. This event took place off the southwestern coast of the Korean peninsula and led to the loss of many lives, most of whom were young students on a school trip. While it is known internationally as the sinking of the Sewol ferry, the deeper layers of this tragedy provide lessons on safety, responsibility, and the value of human life. Before delving into the specific event of that morning when the ferry began to capsize, it is useful to understand a bit about the context. The Sewol ferry was making its way from the port city of Incheon, situated to the northwest near a major metropolitan area, to Jeju, a popular island located off the southern coast. Jeju is famous for its beautiful scenery, mild climate, and status as a beloved tourist destination. Many schools schedule trips there as a chance for students to learn about the island's volcanic landscapes, experience local culture, and bond with classmates. That on board the Sewol ferry that fateful day were 476 people, including crew members, teachers, various passengers, and more than 300 students from Daewon High School. The students were mostly teenagers, excited for a brief escape from the academic pressures that define much of their daily lives. This ferry ride was supposed to be the start of a memorable trip filled with laughter, photographs, and a youthful sense of adventure. Parents at home trusted that their children would have a safe voyage. They looked forward to hearing about the island's iconic places, delicious food, and the overall experience of traveling by ship. Yet unknown to most people on board, the ferry carried hidden issues that would drastically increase its vulnerability. After being purchased secondhand from a Japanese company, the vessel had undergone retrofitting. It was modified to create additional passenger cabins and expand cargo capacity, even though this altered its original design specifications. As a result of these changes, the ship's balance was compromised and the center of gravity shifted higher than recommended. Adding to these concerns, cargo was at times loaded in a manner that did not always follow the safety guidelines meant to keep weight distribution under control. But on April 16th of that year, the Sewol ferry departed with its cargo, passengers, and a large number of high school students. Although the weather conditions seemed calm at first, something went terribly wrong. Not far from the destination, the ferry suddenly began to list and take on water. In a matter of minutes, the angle of the tilt increased, making it difficult for people inside to navigate their way to exits. Confusion and panic spread among passengers who were used to following instructions from crew members and announcements. One of the tragic aspects of the disaster is that many students, adhering to orders broadcast over the ferry's loudspeakers, stayed inside the vessel instead of rushing to the deck. They were told to remain where they were, presumably to avoid causing greater chaos or unbalancing the ship further. Tragically, this advice proved catastrophic. Meanwhile, multiple crew members, including the captain, are reported to have evacuated prematurely, leaving hundreds of others still inside the sinking vessel. For those trapped, the chance to escape diminished rapidly. AS news spread of the ferry's distress. Emergency services, fishing boats, and other nearby vessels rushed to the location, hoping to save survivors and provide assistance. For a time, families back onshore clung to the belief that all was well, given the initial confusion and contradictory information. As more details emerged, it became increasingly clear that the rescue operation was not proceeding smoothly. Over the next few hours, the Sewol ferry continued to submerge, sealing the fate of the many lives that remained on board. A tragedy would unfold. Even as the ferry continued to tilt and sink, the true horror of the situation did not immediately register with observers on land. In the early stages, inaccurate reports and optimistic assumptions led many people to believe that everyone on board would be rescued successfully. Some television stations even announced that all passengers had been saved, creating confusion and giving desperate family members false hope. By the time the facts became clearer, it was already too late for most of those trapped inside the vessel. The ferry had tipped to such a degree that hallways, cabins, and stairwells were inaccessible. Many students were stuck in corridors that had turned into near-vertical shafts, unable to climb upwards because the angles were too steep and the water rushing in caused them to lose any stable footing. Rescuers who arrived on the scene faced immediate challenges. Strong currents in the surrounding waters made it difficult to deploy divers effectively. Moreover, the vessel's rapid descent meant precious minutes were slipping away. Helicopters circled overhead, dropping search and rescue personnel and equipment, but the scale of the operation, along with the complexity of the sinking, overwhelmed these initial efforts. Command centers onshore scrambled to organize teams and coordinate their actions, but the level of preparation for a disaster of this magnitude was lacking. Tensions rose quickly among officials, who struggled to obtain and convey accurate information to government agencies and the anxious public. Word of the ferry accident spread fast, and an ever-growing crowd of parents and relatives began to gather at a location designated by local authorities. They arrived hoping for any scrap of news about their children and loved ones. Many clung to the belief that their sons and daughters had somehow reached a secure area of the vessel and would be rescued once divers were able to make their way inside. In those chaotic hours, rumors and unverified claims circulated through social media and frantic phone calls. Families pored over conflicting broadcasts, searching for reassurance. Whenever a report mentioned survivors being pulled from the water, parents would cling to the possibility that their own child might be among those saved. Tragically, that sense of hope dimmed as the day wore on, replaced by shock and despair. As more precise updates came through, it was revealed that only a fraction of the passengers had managed to evacuate before the ferry submerged. Footage taken by nearby boats and helicopters showed the ship lying on its side, with some people perched on railings or clinging to any surface they could reach on the exposed hull. Meanwhile, hundreds remained inside, a detail that became increasingly certain as officials began to cross-reference passenger lists with the names of those confirmed safe. For the families, the agonizing wait intensified. They heard that the crew had instructed students and other passengers to stay put, leading many to wonder whether an early evacuation order might have prevented these casualties. The students, in particular, were used to following authority. They had been told that huddling in their assigned areas was the correct action, so a great number complied without question. When the tilt of the ship grew extreme and corridors transformed into walls, attempts to exit required navigating complicated angles, enclosed spaces, and swirling floodwaters. Those who did reach the deck had a chance to board lifeboats or jump into the sea, where they might be rescued by nearby vessels or helicopters. Yet so many others never got that FA or that AS word spread about the high number of missing students. The entire nation began to mourn. Public attention fixed on the painful stories emerging from the site. Text messages sent by panicked teenagers, frantic calls that ended abruptly, and haunting videos shot on mobile phones inside the sinking ferry. These final glimpses revealed both the terror and the confusion the students endured. In the days to follow, questions about who bore responsibility for the tragedy would dominate conversations across the country. The scale of the disaster would soon transcend personal and local grief, transforming into a national crisis that exposed wider problems of oversight, safety procedures, and governance. In the aftermath of the initial shock, search and rescue efforts became the primary focus. Divers from various units rushed to the scene, but strong currents and limited visibility made every underwater operation perilous. The ferry structure posed an additional challenge. With sections tilted at extreme angles, passages were blocked by floating debris and overturned furniture. Even for experienced divers, navigating the interior was fraught with danger. Some divers remarked that they could barely see inches in front of their faces, and each dive required careful planning to avoid getting trapped themselves. Meanwhile, the families of those still missing crowded into a temporary support center set up on land. This was a large hall where parents, siblings, and relatives waited for update from officials. The atmosphere was tense, filled with worry and a steady undercurrent of anger. People tried to piece together the timeline of events. When exactly the ferry began tilting, how quickly it sank, why rescue teams could not enter certain parts of the vessel, and whether some alternative response might have saved more passengers. As time passed, it became clear that hopes of finding survivors were diminishing. Outside the hull, volunteers began arriving to offer assistance. Some brought food and water for the families, while others offered their services as grief counselors. Many of these volunteers felt a personal connection to the tragedy. The sight of students' photos and the stories shared by despairing parents moved them to do what little they could to ease the emotional burden. Religious groups also stepped in, setting up small areas for prayer and reflection. This collective effort reflected a society grappling with profound sorrow, yet determined to offer solidarity and compassion. As the days stretched into weeks, the search for bodies became an agonizing process. Recovery divers continued their work, retrieving objects from within the ferry, each item representing a piece of someone's story: a school bag, a set of clothes, a notebook. Every recovered possession carried a bittersweet significance for the relatives waiting nearby. Whenever the announcement came that a body had been found, the entire hall would grow silent, each family silently fearing it could be their loved one. Identification sometimes took time, and the uncertainty compounded the family's grief. In many cases, the condition of the remains made it difficult to confirm identities quickly. Amidst this sorrow, the broader public began demanding accountability. Media outlets examined multiple facets of the disaster: the ferry operator's financial practices, the questionable modifications made to the ship, and the training of the crew. Some reporters uncovered evidence that the company managing the ferry had allegedly prioritized profit over passenger safety. They pointed to unbalanced weight distribution, a reduction in ballast water, and insufficient oversight during safety inspections. Whistleblowers emerged, claiming that certain regulatory bodies have been lax or even complicit, turning a blind eye to violations in exchange for bribes or favors. These revelations fueled public outrage. Demonstrations took place in major cities, where citizens lit candles and carried signs demanding justice for the victims. Many wore yellow ribbons pinned to their clothing as a symbol of remembrance and a call to action. The protests were not merely about punishing those deemed responsible. They were also about pushing for institutional reforms to prevent another catastrophe. People called for stricter safety regulations, better emergency response protocols, and a cultural shift that placed human life above financial gain or convenience. Government representatives held press conferences to address the public, assuring everyone that investigations were underway. Agencies promised comprehensive reforms, emphasizing that the tragedy had exposed deep-rooted problems in the system. Public skepticism, however, was high. Critics pointed out that promises of change often fade once media attention dissipates. They demanded transparency at every step, from the rescue operations to the legal proceedings that would follow. Many felt that only through open disclosure and genuine accountability could the wounds left by this incident begin to heal. As questions mounted, inquiries were launched to determine precisely how the tragedy unfolded and who was at fault. Government officials formed special committees tasked with investigating potential negligence, corruption, and mismanagement. Families of the victims participated in these committees as well, insisting that their voices and experiences be taken into account. Through interviews, document reviews, and on-site inspections, investigators sought to piece together the chain of events that led to one of the country's worst peacetime maritime disasters. As official investigations progressed, many people became increasingly aware that systemic failures had contributed to the ferry disaster. It was not just the crew's actions, but also the entire network of regulations and inspections that allowed the vessel to operate under risky conditions. Investigators dug into records regarding the ship's purchase, conversion, and maintenance. They discovered warning signs that had apparently been overlooked, along with troubling evidence of lax enforcement. Although each department claimed it had followed standard procedures, the broader picture indicated a glaring lack of accountability at multiple levels. Families of the victims closely followed the investigative proceedings. Some of them formed advocacy groups to ensure their concerns were heard. They insisted that the inquiries be transparent, fearing that the truth might be buried by individuals eager to protect their reputations or careers. These groups organized regular meetings with government officials, prosecutors, and media representatives. They shared testimonies and documents, determined to prevent any attempt at covering up facts. Meanwhile, reporters who had begun to uncover questionable ties between regulatory bodies and the ferry company found themselves delving ever deeper into a complex web of relationships. Public anger grew as more revelations came to light. It emerged that safety drills on the ferry were minimal, and many crew members had not received proper training for crisis scenarios. Testimony suggested that certain emergency protocols existed only on paper, while in practice, they were either ignored or poorly understood. This lack of preparedness was widely condemned once the details became public. In emotional interviews, survivors described how some crew members appeared confused and ill-equipped to manage the unfolding catastrophe, adding to the overall chaos. The most intense outrage, however, centered on the conduct of the captain and key officers. Accusations that they abandoned the ship early fueled a national sense of betrayal. Traditionally, a captain is expected to remain on board until every possible effort has been made to evacuate passengers. In this case, many believe the captain had abdicated his moral and professional duty, an act viewed by much of the public as cowardice of the highest order. Court hearings began to examine whether his decisions, combined with those of other senior crew members, directly led to the high death toll. Meanwhile, prosecutors moved to file charges against senior figures of the ferry company itself. They alleged that pressure to maximize profits, reduce operational costs, and push schedules had compromised fundamental safety measures. Reports pointed to routine overloading of cargo, insufficient ballast water to maintain stability, and modifications to the vessel's design that had never received adequate scrutiny. While some company executives denied intentional wrongdoing, mounting evidence suggested they had been aware of issues but had chosen to prioritize financial gains. As the legal process moved forward, families of the victims attended court sessions, holding up photographs of their loved ones. They demanded the harshest possible sentences for those responsible, insisting that only severe punishment would honor the lives lost. In an emotionally charged atmosphere, prosecutors presented internal memos, inspection reports, and communication logs that portrayed a culture of neglect. Defense attorneys, in turn, argued that their clients had not knowingly placed passengers in harm's way, attributing the tragedy to an unfortunate convergence of errors. Yet the public was not satisfied with simply assigning individual blame. Many viewed the incident as a symptom of deeper societal problems, such as cozy relationships between businesses and regulators, or a culture that sometimes privileged speed and profit over thorough safety checks. National conversations emerged about ethics and responsibility, spurring demands for reforms beyond the maritime sector. Politicians promised new measures to tighten oversight and punish corruption, though skepticism remained. Citizens called for a sweeping review of standards in transportation, construction, and other domains where public safety could be compromised. By the end of these early legal proceedings, a sense of collective grief had fused with widespread indignation. People wanted real assurance that the lessons of the ferry disaster would lead to concrete changes. The case took on symbolic weight, representing a broader outcry against negligence and impunity. Families who had lost children or relatives spoke publicly about their hope that this tragedy might spark a lasting transformation, preventing future catastrophes and finally giving them some measure of solace in their immeasurable loss. Public grief over the tragedy continued to swell, with citizens across the country expressing their outrage through candlelight vigils and peaceful marches. These gatherings became focal points for sharing stories of loss and for demanding institutional reform. People of all ages attended, some carrying hand-drawn portraits of the students, others holding signs calling for a complete overhaul of safety standards. Many recounted moments when they had previously encountered unsafe practices in other industries, highlighting a growing concern that the ferry disaster was not an isolated event, but a warning of broader systemic weaknesses as emotional pressure mounted. Government leaders tried to balance investigative transparency with swift policy responses. Special committees were established to examine every detail of the maritime industry's regulations, including how ships were licensed, inspected, and crewed. Proposals emerged for stricter monitoring of passenger vessels, more frequent audits of ship modifications, and mandatory training programs that would certify crew competency in crisis scenarios. While these measures appeared promising on paper, critics questioned whether they would be truly enforced in the long run or fall prey to the same complacency that had allowed previous violations to slip through. In the midst of these developments, national leadership faced increasing scrutiny over the initial rescue operation. Many people wanted answers as to why there had been conflicting statements about the number of passengers rescued, and why those in charge had not immediately deployed the most capable emergency responders. Revelations that certain officials had been slow to act, or that key individuals were absent from crucial decision-making moments, ignited further discontent. Some political figures stepped down, accepting responsibility for missteps in the rescue phase. The Prime Minister tendered his resignation amid calls for greater accountability at all levels of authority. Meanwhile, families of the victims continued to speak publicly about their experiences, becoming de facto activists for reform. They held press conferences in which they recounted the ordeal of waiting for news, only to be met with a confusing patchwork of official statements. In these emotionally charged sessions, parents described the anguish of having their hopes raised by early rumors of large-scale rescues, only to discover that most were untrue. A few people directed their ire at the media, accusing certain outlets of failing to verify sources before broadcasting overly optimistic claims. Others demanded a more thorough review of the command structures that had overseen the ferry's operations. Over time, investigative bodies compiled extensive records of interviews with survivors, crew members, government officials, and representatives of the ferry company. These testimonies painted a picture of a disconnected system in which no single entity took complete responsibility for public safety. The ship had undergone questionable renovations without adequate oversight, yet had been cleared to sail. Inspectors who voiced concerns felt pressure to remain silent. Crew members claimed they were never properly trained for large-scale evacuations, despite transporting hundreds of students. Such findings led to numerous trials, with individuals at various levels facing charges that range from professional negligence to more severe accusations of manslaughter. Some defendants pleaded for leniency, stating that they had been following instructions passed down from their superiors. Others maintained that they had not realized the extent of the vessel's vulnerabilities. Still, prosecutors presented internal company communications suggesting that potential dangers were known but downplayed in order to maintain profitability. While the legal process is carried on, public conversation broadened to include the educational system and the ways in which students are often taught to defer to authority. Many questioned whether a culture of obedience had inadvertently contributed to the high casualty rate. They wondered if students had felt powerless to disobey the instruction to remain in their cabins, even when circumstances clearly turned dire. Educators began reviewing how they taught emergency preparedness, emphasizing the importance of critical thinking and the ability to adapt when instructions might not align with survival. Through it all, the country grappled with a pressing question: how to ensure that this tremendous loss of life would not be in vain. The legacy of the disaster was becoming a potent catalyst for institutional change and a test of society's collective willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about its priorities and practices. As the public conversation broadened, calls for transparency intensified. Investigative journalists continued to dissect the circumstances behind the ferry's ill-fated journey, shining a light on multiple layers of negligence. They revealed that maintenance schedules were often rushed and life-saving equipment had not been regularly checked. Further scrutiny exposed inconsistencies in official inspection reports. Some inspectors admitted to signing off on procedures they had never witnessed, while others confessed to bypassing rigorous checks under pressure from superiors or in exchange for small perks. These findings escalated public skepticism and fueled a desire for sweeping institutional reform. Civil society organizations played an active role in pushing for answers. They collaborated with families of the victims, holding forums where maritime experts explained exactly how poorly enforced regulations could lead to such a disaster. In these public gatherings, diagrams of ships were displayed to illustrate how cargo should be balanced and how crucial ballast water is for stability. People who had never before taken an interest in maritime safety found themselves learning complex technical details. They wanted to understand the specific errors that had claimed so many lives and to prevent them from ever recurring. Many began to ask if there were parallels in other areas of life. Were school buildings adhering to construction regulations? Were bridges across the country fully compliant with engineering standards? The ferry disaster had opened a deeper conversation about how certain shortcuts, once normalized, could eventually create catastrophic scenarios. Legislators responded by proposing a series of bills aimed at strengthening oversight. These included mandatory whistleblower protections, higher penalties for violating safety protocols, and more stringent requirements for companies transporting large groups of passengers. Despite the growing momentum for change, a degree of cynicism lingered. People recalled past incidents, accidents that made headlines and sparked public outrage, only to fade from memory once the news cycle shifted. There was a collective determination among the families of the victims to ensure that this time would be different. They joined public advocacy groups and formed new ones, uniting their voices so that elected officials would not be able to ignore them. Through online platforms, they gathered signatures and spread information about upcoming hearings and court dates. The emotional weight behind their campaign resonated widely, prompting many citizens to remain vigilant and engaged. Meanwhile, the survivors themselves continued to process the trauma of that day. Some struggled with guilt, wondering why they had been spared when so many classmates and friends had not. Others experienced anxiety triggered by everyday situations that reminded them of the ferry. Enclosed spaces, alarms, even the sound of waves. Counselors and mental health professionals reached out to help these individuals cope. Support groups were formed, where survivors shared their experiences and assisted each other in navigating the complex psychological aftermath. During these sessions, it became evident that the emotional toll went far beyond the immediate loss of life. It extended into the sense of shattered trust in institutions once deemed reliable. In parallel, memorials were established across the country to honor those who had perished. Walls adorned with messages of condolence, hand-drawn pictures of the students, and small offerings of flowers or ribbons became solemn reminders of a collective heartbreak. On certain days, volunteers would gather to clean and maintain these sites, ensuring that the memories of the victims were kept alive in a dignified manner. The sight of these memorials triggered an array of emotions, from grief and sadness to resolve and indignation at the systemic lapses that had contributed to the tragedy. As lawsuits advanced in the courts, the legal landscape became more complex. Different parties were eager to shift blame. Corporate representatives pointed fingers at regulators, claiming they had technically complied with all instructions given. Regulators insisted they had been misled about the ferry's condition, while crew members testified that they had never been sufficiently trained for a large-scale disaster. Families of the deceased remained steadfast in their conviction that if one link in the chain of responsibility had acted differently, an inspection done properly, a safety feature checked thoroughly, or a timely order to evacuate, then many lives might have been saved. All these threads wove together into a tapestry of grief, inquiry, and hope for better days. Each revelation added urgency to a national reckoning, prompting citizens and officials alike to consider how their collective actions or inactions shaped a disaster that should never have occurred. The Sewol ferry sinking was no longer just a single event. It had become a profound catalyst for societal introspection, challenging everyone to redefine the balance between economic interests and the sanctity of human life. Over time, the ferry disaster became a touchstone for discussions about leadership, ethics, and the nation's future. Many citizens felt that the way leaders responded to this catastrophe revealed critical insights into their priorities and moral compass. Politicians and agency heads came under pressure to demonstrate genuine accountability, rather than issuing statements that seemed more concerned with protecting reputations than addressing systemic flaws. Public figures who displayed empathy and took direct steps to support grieving families earned praise. Those who appeared evasive or dismissive drew widespread eye in the search for deeper truths. Journalists and scholars delve into the broader cultural and historical context that may have shaped the conditions leading to the tragedy. Some pointed to a deeply ingrained hierarchical system in which challenging authority is often discouraged. This tendency, they argued, contributed to multiple missed opportunities for crew members, inspectors, or even passengers to speak out about potential dangers. Others emphasized the influence of rapid economic growth, which at times fostered a mindset that hurried development could justify bending or overlooking regulations. These analyses sparked debate, with different segments of society reflecting on their own roles in perpetuating norms that might compromise public well-being. At the same time, grassroots movements emerged, advocating for stronger civic participation and transparency in governance. These groups utilized digital platforms to share information, organize events, and mobilize public opinion. Whenever a new piece of evidence surfaced, be it a leaked report or an admission of neglected safety checks, online discussions exploded, quickly reaching thousands of users who demanded explanations and reform. This surge of collective scrutiny made it more difficult for any single individual or department to suppress inconvenient facts. The sense of empowerment among citizens grew, fueled by the conviction that constant vigilance was necessary to prevent future catastrophes. Students, too, were profoundly affected by the tragedy. Many identified with those who lost their lives, as they could easily imagine themselves in that situation, trusting authorities, adhering to instructions, and suddenly finding themselves in grave danger. Schools began holding workshops on emergency preparedness, teaching basic survival strategies for fires, earthquakes, and maritime incidents. Some educators took the initiative to foster open discussions on critical thinking and personal agency. They encouraged students to ask questions and to speak up if something seemed unsafe, challenging the once prevalent idea that absolute compliance is always preferable. Memorial gatherings continued to take place at various locations, each decorated with photographs of victims and messages of support. On certain anniversaries, volunteers lined city streets, distributing small ribbons or flowers for passersby to place at these memorials. Families who had endured unimaginable heartache often attended, offering comfort to those who were just beginning to process their own grief. In these solemn moments, personal stories of love, loss, and regret mingled with calls for broader societal transformation. As public pressure persisted, more details about the ferry's final moments emerged from interviews and data logs. Though the vessel had sent distress signals, responders arrived to find confusion and a breakdown in command. Some crew members insisted they had tried to maintain order, only to be stymied by conflicting directives. The lack of a centralized, authoritative voice resulted in precious minutes lost, minutes that, under optimal conditions, might have been used to guide people to safety. Reconstruction of the timeline revealed that several vital announcements over the public address system might have been misunderstood or mistranslated, further complicating an already desperate situation. Legal proceedings continued to unfold. Multiple trials ran in parallel, each examining a different aspect of the disaster. Operational failures, regulatory negligence, and alleged misconduct by company executives. Witness after witness took the stand, recalling harrowing details that conveyed the sheer terror experienced on that day. Some described hearing cries for help echo through flooded corridors. Others recounted feeling the deck tilt beneath them to the point where gravity pulled them against walls. The courts attempted to weigh individual accountability against the pervasive institutional shortcomings that had allowed so many hazards to intersect. Why now, the ferry disaster was woven into the nation's collective consciousness, shaping dialogues about reform in ways that few other events had. People demanded structural changes that would prioritize safety across all industries. They scrutinized engineering codes, championed independent oversight committees, and promoted ethical leadership. Despite ongoing debates and unresolved questions, a resolute commitment emerged to honor the memory of those who had perished by ensuring that negligence of this scale would never again be tolerated. The steps taken thus far were only the beginning of a long process, one propelled by sorrow, galvanized by indignation, and sustained by a collective promise to protect future generations. In the midst of the ongoing legal battles, public ceremonies, and media scrutiny, discussions emerged about how best to memorialize the lives that have been lost and to enshrine the lessons learned from this tragedy. Civic groups proposed the construction of a permanent memorial, not just as a tribute to those who had perished, but also as an educational space where visitors could learn about maritime safety and the importance of holding institutions to account. Supporters of this idea believe that a dedicated site of remembrance could prompt visitors, both local citizens and those from abroad, to reflect on how oversights in leadership, training, or enforcement might have tragic consequences. Others suggested that transforming the wreckage of the ferry into part of a museum could serve a similar function. By preserving sections of the vessel, people could see firsthand how critical design flaws and overloaded cargo areas might have contributed to its instability. Some families supported such proposals, thinking it might foster tangible understanding of what occurred beneath the waves. Yet, a significant number of grieving relatives felt uneasy about putting the ship on public display, fearing it might be turned into a spectacle rather than a sober reminder. In the end, the question of how best to remember this event remained a delicate issue, calling for a balance between honoring the departed, educating future generations, and respecting the emotional toll borne by those who lost loved ones. Meanwhile, salvage operations moved forward, albeit slowly. The sunken ferry was located at a depth that complicated the work of raising it in a single piece. Specialist teams from multiple sectors attempted to stabilize the wreck, mindful that further damage could scatter debris and remains across the seabed. Technical challenges were also high, involving heavy-duty cranes, enormous barges, and a series of cables to lift the ferry out of the water. The financial costs of these endeavors soared, prompting debates about whether the expense was justified. Families of the missing insisted that if there were even the smallest chance of recovering additional remains or clarifying unresolved questions, the cost was more than warranted. Once initial preparations were complete, engineers began a step-by-step operation to partially refloat the vessel. At designated intervals, they pumped water out of compartments and secured large pontoons to help buoy the ferry structure. Throughout this painstaking process, officials stood by to document any discoveries made. At times, fragments of personal belongings surfaced: phones, clothing, a strained notebook, serving as heart-wrenching testaments to lives that had been abruptly cut short. Divers also kept a watchful eye for any previously undiscovered remains, keenly aware that even the smallest artifact could provide some measure of closure for a grieving family. Public interest in the salvage process was immense. News broadcasts followed each new phase of the operation in real time, accompanied by commentary from maritime experts. For many viewers, watching the slow, careful efforts to raise the ferry symbolized a collective need for answers and accountability. Social media platforms brimmed with photos, video snippets, and emotional messages. Some posts applauded the dedication of the salvage workers, while others criticized perceived delays or inefficiencies. Though not everyone agreed on the methods, virtually all recognized the significance of bringing the vessel back to the surface. After significant challenges, the remains of the ferry finally broke through the waves. The sight of its rusted hull and crushed decks evoked deep sorrow, a stark visual of the horror that had unfolded. Crews covered sensitive areas to shield any human remains from public view, mindful of preserving both dignity and potential evidence for further investigation. As the ferry was towed toward a port facility for more detailed examination, a solemn mood descended on all involved. Families stood by, some shedding tears, others silently gazing at the ruined structure that had once carried their children or siblings. Investigators prepared to analyze every inch of the vessel's remains, determined to glean insights into how so many safety measures had failed simultaneously. In the period that followed, careful forensic inspections were performed. Experts scrutinized fractures in the ship's frame, tested the integrity of watertight doors, and measured angles to confirm assumptions about how the ferry had rolled onto its side. They documented each finding meticulously, hoping to clarify any lingering ambiguities. Some believed these investigations would finally offer definitive proof of who or what bore the brunt of responsibility. Others, however, argued that no array of data would bring the comfort that bereaved families truly sought. Still, everyone agreed that this meticulous approach was essential to honor the memories of the lost and to uphold the promise that such an event would never be repeated. After the recovered ferry was secured at a port facility, a new phase of detailed examination began. Forensic experts and engineers were granted access to inspect every deck, corridor, and hull plate. They conducted meticulous measurements, looking for definitive proof of the disaster's underlying causes. Were the modifications carried out in a way that undermined structural integrity? Had the ballast water been insufficient to maintain stability? Each query guided their tools and notebooks as they documented every fracture and deformity that might explain how the vessel's final moments played out. Simultaneously, investigators referenced surviving data from onboard instruments, such as navigation logs and engine records. Although portions of this data were damaged or incomplete, some fragments remained usable, cross-referenced with testimony from crew and passengers. These technical details formed a complex puzzle. Specialists recreated possible sequences of events, abrupt turns, irregular weight distribution, and potential mechanical malfunctions. In this controlled environment, away from the swirling currents of open water, it became easier to form theories about the exact trajectory that had led the ferry onto its side, then down beneath the waves. For many family members, this forensic phase offered a glimmer of closure. They hoped that a full scientific account of the tragedy would either confirm or dispel the painful uncertainties they had wrestled with since the day their loved ones were lost. Were there moments when an immediate evacuation order could have made all the difference? Did a failure in steering mechanisms prompt the fatal list? Or had the ship been too compromised from the start, rendering any last-minute heroics futile? These were not simply academic questions. They held the potential to answer the haunting what-if scenarios that replayed endlessly in grieving minds. Yet, the process of dismantling and studying the ferry proved lengthy and often excruciating. Some families found it difficult to watch news segments showing images of the decaying interior where their relatives had spent their final moments. Others insisted on being present as closely as allowed, believing that witnessing the investigation firsthand was a way to ensure that nothing would be hidden or overlooked. Law enforcement worked with these families to provide limited supervised visits, though many found the site overwhelming. Alongside the technical evaluations, legal proceedings continued in multiple courts. High-profile figures from the ferry company were called to testify, including executives who had overseen cargo loading and vessel maintenance. Prosecutors questioned them about the decisions that led to repeated overloading, alleged cost-cutting measures that compromised safety, and the possibility that warnings from lower-level employees had been systematically ignored. Defense teams countered by suggesting that no one could have predicted the precise combination of factors culminating in the catastrophic sinking. They emphasized that maritime operations always carry inherent risks and pointed to years of uneventful voyages prior to the disaster. Meanwhile, mid-level managers came forward, some confessing to having felt powerless within a corporate hierarchy that prized efficiency over caution. A few recalled instances where they had submitted reports about potential hazards, only to be told that such concerns fell outside their purview. These disclosures resonated with a public already critical of top-down structures that discouraged questioning. Seeing this dynamic play out so visibly in court reinforced calls for a broader cultural change, one that would empower employees at all levels to speak up about safety issues without fear of retribution. As the trials proceeded, survivors and the families of victims continued to press for meaningful reform. They held rallies outside courthouses, speaking to the press about the necessity of transforming the entire maritime sector. Their message was simple: no verdict would return loved ones or undo the trauma, but a thorough reckoning could spare other families similar grief. In an effort to harness the heightened awareness, civil society organizations launched public education campaigns about ferry travel. These campaigns instructed prospective passengers on how to identify red flags, such as overloaded decks or poor emergency briefings, and urged them to report anything amiss. The idea was that an informed and proactive public could supplement the efforts of official regulators, forming a second layer of scrutiny. Within academic circles, researchers began incorporating the ferry disaster into case studies on engineering, public administration, and crisis management. University departments hosted seminars that addressed not just the technical elements of the sinking, but also the sociological factors behind it. The willingness of authorities to look the other way, the lack of robust channels for whistleblowing, and the obedience ingrained in many youths who hesitated to challenge instructions, even when danger was evident. These scholarly explorations aim to ensure that future leaders, policymakers, and innovators would have a deeper understanding of the ethical responsibilities tied to their professions that end this way. The ferry's legacy was woven ever more deeply into the social fabric. Bit by bit, each revelation from the investigations, each piece of courtroom testimony, and each public action shaped the collective memory of a nation still grappling with sorrow and righteous anger. Though the road to comprehensive change was far from complete, The combined force of these parallel efforts, scientific, legal, and cultural, pushed the public conversation forward, inching society closer to a place where such a calamity would never again be repeated. Public awareness of the ferry disaster steadily evolved into a broader movement for accountability, reinforcing a shared desire to transform grief into meaningful change. In various cities, people held public seminars and workshops not only on maritime safety, but also on ethics and leadership, corporate responsibility, and civic participation. Universities offered open forums where students, faculty, and members of the public could engage with experts on transportation policy and emergency management. These gatherings fostered a sense of collective learning, encouraging participants to ask pointed questions about why disasters happen and how communities can become more resilient. Meanwhile, anniversaries of the disaster became solemn occasions for nationwide reflection. On each passing year, memorial events were organized in local squares, school auditoriums, and religious venues. Attendees lit candles, recited the names of the victims, and shared personal reflections. Photographs of the students, smiling faces frozen in time, adorned walls and makeshift altars, inspiring both tears and a renewed call to uphold the sanctity of human life. Many of these gatherings were not merely ceremonial. They often included talks by safety experts or updates from those involved in legal proceedings. In this way, remembrance and advocacy merged, ensuring that the issues underlying the disaster would not fade from the public mind. Families of the victims played a key role in shaping these memorials. They spoke candidly about their heartbreak, but also about their determination to see reforms enacted. Often, parents who had lost a child would stand before a microphone, recounting cherished memories and the anguished moments of waiting for rescue updates. Then, with a tremor in their voice, they would shift to urging officials and citizens alike to remain vigilant. They implore their listeners never to forget that inaction or indifference can pave the way for repeated failures. Through these emotionally charged testimonies, the memory of those who perished continued to exert a profound moral force on society. The political climate also felt the impact of this movement. Although many leaders initially focused on expressing condolences and promising change, citizens demanded visible proof of follow-through. Elected representatives who championed stronger safety legislation found receptive audiences, particularly among younger voters who saw the disaster as emblematic of systemic neglect. At the same time, politicians who downplayed the need for sweeping reforms encountered resistance, facing a public that had grown skeptical of vague assurances. Public debates often revolve around whether authorities were doing enough to close regulatory loopholes or to impose meaningful penalties on companies that disregarded safety rules. In response to mounting pressure, certain agencies undertook ambitious internal evaluations. They hired consultants to review emergency protocols and commissioned outside experts to assess everything from training curricula to inspection policies. A wave of retirements and resignations swept through some departments as officials deemed complicit in past negligence chose to step aside. These changes were met with cautious optimism. Some observers praised them as a necessary purge, while others worried that institutional inertia might persist once public attention shifted elsewhere. Nevertheless, the sheer intensity of public scrutiny made it harder for complacent attitudes to remain hidden. Civil courts, too, became a critical arena for shaping long-term consequences. Families who sought compensation or punitive damages pursued lawsuits against the ferry company, as well as specific government offices they believed had failed in their oversight duties. Judges deliberated on the extent to which financial accountability could bring about justice or deter future misconduct. While no court ruling could fully heal the emotional wounds, Many hoped that substantial judgments against negligent parties would send an unmistakable message to other operators across the maritime industry. The idea was to reinforce, through legal precedent, that profits could never legitimately override public safety. Over time, the changes rippling out from the ferry disaster began to intersect with larger national conversations on governance and social values. Community organizations pushed for transparency in public contracts, demanding that local and national bodies release details on how safety inspections were conducted. Educational institutions revisited curricula on civic responsibility, inserting lessons that highlighted the importance of questioning authorities and reporting hazards. On social media, citizen journalists continued to investigate other potential flashpoints, from dilapidated infrastructure to questionable construction practices. Although not every lead yielded conclusive revelations, the collective mindset had unmistakably shifted toward proactive engagement. By this stage, it was evident that the ferry disaster had done more than expose flaws in one sector. It had ignited an evolving discourse on the proper balance between economic development, regulatory oversight, and ethical governance. Individuals across the country, whether involved in formal policymaking or simple day-to-day living, found themselves reflecting on what it meant to value life above convenience. In a world where shortcuts often go unnoticed until tragedy strikes, this renewed focus on caution and accountability carried hopeful possibilities. The drive for reform, propelled by heartbreak and galvanized by moral conviction, showed no signs of abating, laying the groundwork for future generations to inherit a society more alert to the perils of neglect. Over time, the ferry disaster became a pivotal case study illustrating how systemic issues can accumulate and culminate in tragic outcomes. Students in fields as diverse as public policy, engineering, law, and journalism found themselves poring over case documents, reading eyewitness accounts, and analyzing the eventual policy changes spurred by the catastrophe. Professors used the incident to demonstrate how negligence, corruption, and a culture of unquestioning obedience can combine in fatal ways. Their aim was to instill a sense of professional ethics and civic duty in future graduates, preparing them to recognize warning signs and speak out in situations where lives could be at risk. Outside academia, grassroots advocacy groups maintained pressure on public institutions. They organized workshops in local community centers, inviting residents to learn practical safety measures. Everything from recognizing substandard safety equipment to understanding how to file complaints if they observe violations. Many of these groups included survivors of the disaster or relatives of those who had not returned. Their personal accounts served as a stark reminder that complacency has real human consequences. In these sessions, it was common to hear someone say, "If we had known then what we know now, perhaps we could have saved our children." Meanwhile, the legal dimension continued to unfold in complex ways. Some high-profile cases resulted in convictions and prison sentences for executives and officials held directly responsible for the ferry's unsafe condition. Yet, beyond these headline-making judgments, a broader network of civil suits proceeded at a slower pace. Plaintiffs argued that they had experienced emotional trauma from the disaster and deserved recognition of their suffering. In certain rulings, courts awarded compensatory damages, citing negligence on the part of both private entities and public agencies. These decisions prompted discussions about the limits of monetary compensation. Could financial awards ever truly address the profound sense of loss experienced by parents and spouses who had lost loved ones? In parallel, a new generation of activists took to social media platforms to report on potential safety lapses in other sectors. They saw themselves as citizen watchdogs, determined to ensure that the hard-earned lessons from the ferry disaster would not be dismissed or forgotten. If they spotted overloaded trucks on highways, poorly maintained amusement rides, or other obvious hazards, they documented the issue and contacted relevant authorities. The quick dissemination of information online made it harder for officials to ignore such reports, as viral posts could generate public outrage within hours. Sometimes local governments responded proactively, dispatching inspectors to the site and, if necessary, imposing penalties or shutting down operations until problems were corrected. Not everyone applauded this surge in vigilance. Some businesses complained about what they termed excessive meddling by citizens and inspectors, fearing that stricter rules might harm economic competitiveness. They argued that companies needed a certain degree of flexibility to innovate, and that an overly cautious approach could lead to bureaucratic paralysis. However, advocates for safety countered that the ferry disaster itself stood as a grim testimony to the perils of cutting corners and avoiding transparency. They insisted that any short-term inconvenience or cost was negligible compared to the irreparable harm done when human lives are lost in the political arena. Certain elected officials began weaving stronger safety guarantees into their campaign platforms. They promised to champion legislative reforms that tightened regulatory loopholes across various industries: shipping, construction, energy, and more. While some voters remained skeptical, years of public debate and activism had undeniably reshaped the country's policy landscape, making it harder for politicians to dismiss calls for change. New laws emerged, mandating tougher penalties for false inspection reports and offering better protection for whistleblowers. The intention was to foster an environment where stepping forward with concerns about lapses in safety procedures was seen as a public service, not a betrayal of one's superiors. By this point, the ferry disaster had truly transcended its immediate context, serving as a lens through which citizens examined many facets of their daily lives. On national television and in small-town gatherings, people debated the balance between personal responsibility and institutional accountability. They recognized the importance of nurturing a climate where ordinary individuals felt both informed and empowered. In a society once shaped by deference to authority and the pursuit of rapid progress, a new ethic of mutual care and precaution began to take root. While the road to fully realizing these ideals was long and fraught with challenges, the trajectory was clear. Through the tears, heartbreak, and resolve forged in the aftermath of the disaster, the nation found itself more vigilant, more caring, and more united in the mission of safeguarding every single life under its watch. As the years passed, many families impacted by the ferry tragedy remained committed to ensuring that their loved ones would never be reduced to mere statistics in a history book. They met periodically to exchange updates, support one another, and discuss progress with ongoing lawsuits and regulatory reforms. These gatherings served as a reminder that even though daily headlines had moved on to different topics, the emotional and legal journeys of those directly affected were far from over. The steady rhythm of these meetings reaffirmed a collective promise to keep telling their stories until genuine and lasting change was secured. At the same time, cultural conversations surrounding the importance of youth agency continued to evolve. Educators began introducing more interactive methods in classrooms, encouraging students to question, debate, and challenge established viewpoints if they had valid reasons for concern. Many teachers spoke openly about how the ferry disaster had illuminated a gap in the way young people were taught to respond to authority, especially under extraordinary or crisis circumstances. These pedagogical shifts were subtle at first. Additional class discussions on risk assessment, small group exercises simulating emergency situations, but they carried a powerful message. Young minds deserved both the freedom and the responsibility to make critical decisions in perilous moments. Nonprofit organizations that had formed in the wake of the tragedy kept up their momentum as well. Some offered specialized training to local community leaders, teaching them how to organize immediate responses in emergencies before official help could arrive. Others created detailed checklists and guidelines for citizens traveling by ferry or other modes of transportation. They emphasized the significance of basic safety briefings, the proper wearing of life jackets, and the importance of calmly verifying whether staff were adequately prepared for urgent evacuations. By disseminating such knowledge widely, these organizations hope to empower ordinary people to become first responders, reducing dependence on potentially flawed systems. Politically, the landscape continued to shift. Candidates who touted their commitment to safety regulations found themselves better received by a public still reeling from the collective trauma of the ferry sinking. Certain policy proposals, such as mandating monthly drills for commercial maritime crews and installing more advanced tracking technologies on passenger vessels, gained traction where they might once have been dismissed as excessive. A zero-tolerance attitude toward violations of safety standards began to take shape in various sectors. Companies caught flouting guidelines discovered that penalties had become harsher and public patience far thinner than before. However, some observers cautioned that progress could be fragile. Without consistent oversight and a sustained willingness to self-reflect, old habits might resurface. They pointed out that institutional memory can fade as officials retire and new employees come on board. Vigilance, they argued, must therefore be intergenerational. Passing the lessons learned from the ferry disaster to the next wave of public servants, community advocates, and young professionals would be crucial to preventing backsliding. Part of this mission involved creating accessible archives of case studies, procedural documents, and personal testimonies so that future leaders could understand the full complexity of what had occurred. Meanwhile, survivors grappled with an ever-evolving form of grief. Some described feeling caught between their desire to move forward and their lingering sense of responsibility to those who did not survive. In therapy sessions organized by support groups, participants spoke of learning to balance advocacy and personal healing. The idea that they could honor the fallen through persistent efforts to enhance public safety became a common theme. Counselors guided survivors toward reframing their trauma into motivation for constructive action. While this emotional journey was by no means easy or linear, it offered a direction that many found meaningful in parallel. The realm of art and media began reflecting on the ferry tragedy with greater nuance. Filmmakers produced documentaries that interwove interviews, archival footage, and reenactments of key moments. These works attempted to capture not just the dramatic sinking itself, but the mosaic of human experiences, compassion, anger, guilt, resilience that followed in its wake. Novels and stage plays drew inspiration from the event, exploring themes like collective responsibility and the complexities of survival. Some critics lauded these creative projects for keeping the disaster in the public eye, while others worried about the possibility of oversimplification or sensationalism. Regardless, the presence of these stories in mainstream culture underscored how deeply the incident had embedded itself in the national psyche. Such reflections demonstrated that true change involves more than just new laws and protocols. It requires a shift in the very narratives that shape how people see themselves and their society. Through classrooms, town halls, political debates, community initiatives, and artistic expressions, the lessons of the ferry disaster gained new life, ensuring that its memory would continue to influence attitudes and actions long after the headlines had faded. The resolve to protect human life remained steadfast, fueled by the unshakable belief that every person's safety and dignity mattered in the grand tapestry of a nation's future. In the wake of so much trauma and transformation, a new generation began to absorb the lessons of the ferry disaster, weaving them into their own sense of identity and responsibility. Younger citizens, many of whom were children at the time of the tragedy, grew up hearing stories of both the heartbreaking losses and the efforts toward reform that followed. In their eyes, the event represented not just a sorrowful chapter in national history, but also a turning point that highlighted the power of collective action. Through classroom discussions, television documentaries, and casual conversations with elders, they came to understand how everyday people could band together to demand real accountability and lasting institutional changes. Community leaders took note of this generational shift, recognizing that the values of transparency and proactive engagement had firmly taken root among younger demographics. They began crafting initiatives that channeled this energy. Town hall meetings were scheduled at times convenient for students and young professionals, allowing them to contribute directly to policy dialogues. Local councils experimented with youth advisory committees, inviting teenagers to help shape recommendations on matters such as neighborhood safety and disaster preparedness. Such projects not only offered fresh perspectives, but also symbolized a commitment to passing on the lessons learned from the ferry incident in a tangible way. Amid these positive developments, the ongoing challenge lay in maintaining momentum. As daily life resumed its usual cadence for many citizens, the news cycle inevitably moved on to other stories and crises. Nonetheless, reminders of the ferry disaster persisted in public spaces. Shrines filled with photographs, poems, and tokens of remembrance continued to draw visitors who came to pay their respects. Local artists organized murals depicting acts of bravery and solidarity, ensuring that city streets retained visual homages to the profound sorrow and unity the tragedy had inspired. In this interplay between forward progress and enduring memory, one could sense the dual imperative of healing and vigilance. The legislative realm mirrored these social currents. Lawmakers responded to continued advocacy by revisiting earlier statutes, strengthening them where loopholes had become apparent. They introduced more concrete enforcement mechanisms, such as surprise inspections of passenger vessels and stiffer penalties for falsifying inspection reports. In parallel, legal protections for whistleblowers were expanded, giving potential witnesses greater assurance that speaking out would not jeopardize their livelihoods. While many activists still deemed these steps insufficient, they acknowledged that the incremental tightening of regulations and processes signaled a deeper cultural shift in how authorities approach public safety. At the same time, a few high-profile incidents served as cautionary tales, revealing that complacency could resurface in unexpected places. A smaller-scale emergency at a provincial pier, for instance, exposed lapses in evacuation protocols, prompting immediate calls to revisit and update local emergency guidelines. These episodes reminded everyone that the ferry disaster had been a wake-up call to be heeded continuously, not merely an historic event whose lessons could be boxed away. It also underscored that regulations alone, however robust, could not guarantee safety without the will and diligence to uphold them day after day. Within families still mourning the loss of children or siblings, the process of healing continued at a measured pace. Grief counselors noted that while many relatives found solace in activism, believing their advocacy honored their loved ones, others retreated, seeking a quieter path of remembrance. Occasionally, memorial groups clashed over how best to preserve the dead's legacy, with some pushing for more confrontational protest and others emphasizing community service. Such disagreements reflected the complexity of grief, as well as the diversity of personalities grappling with an immense emotional burden. Still, the overarching consensus among these families was that the nation must never forget the cruel lesson taught by the sinking of a vessel that should have been safe. Their personal pain had become a public testament to the cost of negligence, spurring renewed efforts to ensure that industry, government, and society at large treated the safeguarding of human life as an absolute priority. Year by year, step by step, the spirit of reform carried on, sustained by the quiet but unwavering determination of those who refused to let complacency undo the progress so painfully achieved. In their steadfast resolve, the tragedy transcended a singular, sorrowful event, transforming instead into a lasting impetus for communal growth and ethical vigilance. As more time passed, a growing number of scholars, policymakers, and media figures began to view the ferry disaster not merely as a discrete event, but as a crucial hinge in modern civic life. They noted how it had provoked sustained introspection about the structures that underpin safety and public trust. Certain research institutes produced comprehensive reports analyzing how the tragedy had reshaped sectors like education, civil service, and community organization. Using survey data, they demonstrated how citizens had become more inclined to scrutinize official statements, demand transparency, and engage in local governance. Indeed, what began as a nation's grief had blossomed into an enduring ethos of questioning and accountability. Meanwhile, continuing legal cases attracted occasional bursts of public attention, especially when evidence surfaced about possible malpractice or undue political influence. At times, investigators reopened inquiries into how specific licenses were granted or renewed, poring over logs and financial statements to trace any sign of bribery or collusion. Some of these probes led to additional indictments. Although such developments reignited anger among those who felt the system was still riddled with corruption, they also provided proof that vigilance could yield tangible results. No longer were backroom dealings guaranteed to remain hidden. The collective memory of the ferry disaster prompted many to speak up if they suspected wrongdoing in the international arena. The ferry tragedy gradually became a reference point in discussions on maritime regulations and crisis response. Naval experts and rescue organizations from various countries examined the circumstances to refine their own protocols for mass evacuation and underwater salvage. Conferences devoted sessions to analyzing the social aftermath of maritime disasters, using the ferry case to illustrate how a single sinking could galvanize an entire populace. Over time, foreign journalists visited memorial sites, documenting how the local communities had organized and how the country's leaders continued to grapple with the disaster's legacy. These international connections led to collaborative projects aimed at improving safety standards globally. Joint training programs allowed rescue teams from multiple nations to learn from each other's best practices, incorporating both technical advancements and the ethical considerations brought to the forefront by the ferry incident. Technological firms, too, found themselves in discussions about innovations that might make large vessels safer, improve sensors, upgraded life-saving equipment, and better ways to relay urgent updates to both passengers and shore-based authorities. Although cost and bureaucratic hurdles sometimes slowed these initiatives, the overarching message remained clear. The world had taken note, and other nations wished to avoid repeating such a tragedy. Back at home, youth-led groups carried the torch of reform in creative ways. University clubs organized documentary screenings followed by panel discussions, ensuring that incoming classes never lost sight of what the ferry disaster represented. Some high school students participated in role-playing exercises designed to simulate emergencies, learning how to remain calm under duress and make independent judgments when instructions seemed contradictory. These grassroots educational projects aligned with the broader societal shift toward empowering individuals, especially the young, to think critically rather than following directives blindly. Over the years, the physical sites associated with the disaster also underwent transformation. Temporary memorials, originally improvised with flowers and handwritten messages, evolved into more permanent installations. Sculptures and plaques were commissioned, each bearing inscriptions that paid homage to those who had been lost. The atmosphere at these memorial sites blended sorrow with a quiet determination, as visitors reflected on the collective pledge that such an event should never recur. Some people found closure by leaving behind letters to the departed, while others joined in silent contemplation, contemplating both the fragility and the resilience of human communities. Despite these visible markers of progress, there remained voices cautioning that complacency could creep back in. Advocacy organizations reminded the public of near-miss incidents, smaller-scale accidents that did not generate headlines but hinted at persisting risks. They called for more rigorous checks to ensure that regulations were genuinely upheld, not just theoretically enforced on paper. Periodically, they requested official updates on how the ferry disaster's lessons were being integrated into policy reviews and emergency drills across different regions. Their stance was firm. Real change had to be continuous, woven into the daily workings of government agencies, private corporations, and civil society alike. Hence, the ferry disaster's imprint on the nation and beyond was far from fleeting. Through institutional reforms, new cultural norms, persistent legal efforts, and international collaborations, the tragedy had stimulated a far-reaching reevaluation of priorities. To many citizens, it stood as both a heartbreaking memory and a solemn benchmark, an event that demanded ongoing accountability and a strengthened commitment to safeguarding human life. In this dual role, the ferry disaster became an ever-present catalyst, spurring each new generation to question, innovate, and uphold the principles that ensure a collective future defined by empathy, vigilance, and respect. As the ferry disaster continued to resonate through the nation's collective conscience, the integration of its lessons became more deeply woven into daily life. At the governmental level, policymakers were increasingly mindful of ensuring that updated rules and regulations were not just passed, but effectively implemented. Regular audits took place to verify whether agencies were adhering to new safety protocols, particularly in areas involving large-scale transportation and mass gatherings. The sheer scope of these regulatory shifts was significant. It encompassed rail lines, bus networks, and event venues, all under the broader umbrella of public safety reform. Within this transformed environment, citizens developed a heightened sense of personal responsibility. Rather than relying solely on official assurances, individuals began to ask more direct questions whenever they traveled or attended public events. Parents inspected seat belts and life jackets for themselves before trusting others to do so. College students, some of whom had lived through the ferry tragedy as younger pupils, applied critical thinking skills to everyday situations. They reminded one another that vigilance was not about paranoia. It was about ensuring that no repeat of such an event would ever again catch the public unprepared. Meanwhile, the cultural sphere remained a fertile ground for processing the disaster's emotional and ethical dimensions. Museums featured rotating exhibits that explored themes of loss, remembrance, and resilience, incorporating testimonies from survivors and the families of victims. Plays and short films delved into the nuances of leadership failure, exploring how small decisions could snowball into large-scale catastrophes. Rather than blaming one individual or institution alone, these creative works encouraged audiences to examine how diffuse systems of negligence can contribute to tragedies. They also highlighted stories of quiet heroism and kindness, underscoring the ways in which compassion and solidarity often emerge from hardship. Nonprofit organizations continue to adapt their outreach methods, partnering with schools and workplaces to deliver practical safety workshops. In some cities, these organizations establish simulation centers where participants could practice responding to floods, fires, or transport malfunctions under controlled conditions. The hope was that by building muscle memory around safety procedures, ordinary people would be able to act swiftly and decisively in real emergencies. Counselors were also on hand to discuss the psychological aspects of crisis response, recognizing that panic and confusion can undermine even the best prepared plans. As these programs flourished, public discourse turned to how best to sustain momentum. Some commentators warned that the drive for reform risked losing steam if budgets were slashed or if complacent attitudes re-emerged once headlines faded. In response, Civic groups argued for permanent watchdog bodies that could monitor safety standards across industries, similar to consumer protection agencies, but focused on verifying compliance with emergency readiness. Opinion polls suggested that a majority of the population supported such measures, confirming that the tragedy had permanently raised expectations regarding government oversight. In the private sector, companies began to view robust safety track records as a selling point rather than a regulatory hassle. Insurance premiums sometimes offered better rates for businesses that invested in advanced safety measures, improved staff training, modern equipment, and detailed evacuation drills. Corporate responsibility initiatives frequently referenced the ferry disaster as a motivating force behind their renewed commitment to protecting both employees and customers. This shift in perspective indicated that the lessons of the tragedy were filtering into corporate cultures, influencing decisions at the boardroom level. Despite this progress, emotional scars lingered. Family associations formed by those who had lost loved ones still convened regularly, continuing to share their experiences and question whether more could be done. Younger relatives, nieces, nephews, or siblings of the victims grew older, guided by the desire to keep the memory of their departed alive. They found that channeling their grief into advocacy provided them with both comfort and purpose, allowing them to transform personal pain into communal vigilance. In interviews, they spoke candidly about the dual burden of coping with loss while upholding a legacy that demanded meaningful reform at the same time. Certain critics began to reflect on the broader psychological toll of constant alertness. While lauding the nationwide push for better safety standards, they cautioned that an environment of unending caution could stifle creativity or create undue anxiety in everyday contexts. Psychologists suggested a balanced approach: remain watchful, but also cultivate trust in newly improved systems when justified by evidence. In their view, the key lay in fostering resilience, both at the individual level, through mental health support and personal preparedness training, and at the collective level, through transparent governance and community cooperation. Through these ongoing endeavors, the country continued to evolve, building upon the frameworks established in the immediate aftermath of the ferry's sinking. Each policy revision, public forum, and heartfelt personal story underscored the lasting resonance of an event that had once threatened to break the nation's spirit. Instead, it became a defining crucible, forging an ethic of accountability and empathy that lived on in the hearts and minds of citizens determined never to let tragedy strike in the same way again. As the years went by, the ferry disaster increasingly felt like a distant event to those who had not been personally touched by its consequences. The country's technological and economic progress continued apace, and many citizens found themselves immersed in other concerns: global market pressures, environmental issues, new cultural trends. Still, reminders of the tragedy retained a subtle but persistent presence. Public buildings and transportation hubs displayed updated safety posters, detailing evacuation routes and contact numbers for reporting hazards. Children in primary schools learned basic emergency procedures, and older students practiced drills with a seriousness that had not existed before. Beyond mere protocol, these efforts symbolized a shared vow to remain vigilant, anchored in collective memory. At the same time, some in society questioned whether the intense emotional force that had once galvanized reforms might be waning. Journalists noted that while improvements were evident in ferry regulations and certain other high-risk sectors, new threats could emerge elsewhere if complacency set in. From time to time, reports surfaced of minor lapses, a shortage of lifeboats on a smaller tourist vessel, or a local government skipping routine building inspections. Though none approached the scale of the original ferry tragedy, such incidents serve as cautionary signs that a return to old habits was always possible. Commentators reminded their audiences that genuine safety is an ongoing process, not a single milestone that can be crossed and forgotten. For the families deeply scarred by the disaster, these sporadic lapses reignited painful memories. Some responded by redoubling their activism, reaching out to local communities with renewed calls for transparency and compliance. They urged citizens to demand real-time data on safety checks whenever stepping aboard a vessel, booking a train, or entering a public venue. Their message was that robust safety measures require a partnership between officials and the public. Regulations lose their teeth if people remain unaware or disengaged. Meanwhile, survivors who had been teenagers at the time of the sinking were now adults, forging new paths in higher education and the workforce. Carrying the trauma of that day, they found themselves uniquely positioned to champion responsible leadership wherever they went. A few pursued careers in public administration, determined to reform the very agencies that had once failed them. Others entered journalism, law, or social work, harnessing personal experience to shine a light on ongoing vulnerabilities. Though many grappled with lingering emotional wounds, they saw their career choices as part of a broader mission, to ensure that no young person in the future would face the same ordeal. The media landscape also continued to evolve, with documentaries periodically revisiting the ferry story. Some films focused on untold personal narratives, the teacher who stayed behind to help students escape, or the local fishing boat captain who rescued frantic passengers from water. Others took a more investigative angle, uncovering additional details about regulatory loopholes and hidden financial dealings. While the public's appetite for such content had ebbed somewhat, these productions still drew enough viewership to keep the conversation alive, reminding audiences of the fine line between normalcy and catastrophe. In public policy circles, a growing emphasis on safety culture had broadened to include digital and environmental concerns. Policymakers drew parallels between maritime disasters and potential threats like data breaches or industrial pollution. They pointed out that the same patterns, poor oversight, ignored warnings, and underestimation of worst-case scenarios, could lead to crises in other domains. Thus, the ferry disaster's lessons became an allegory for the need to proactively address any systemic weakness, whether physical, organizational, or technological. Institutes and think tanks published reports comparing how societies worldwide handled large-scale emergencies, positioning the ferry incident as an instructive case for global audiences. Meanwhile, everyday citizens continued to find small, meaningful ways to incorporate the memory of the disaster into their routines. Some donated a portion of their income to charities devoted to maritime safety or youth empowerment. Others volunteered as safety marshals in local festivals, ensuring crowd control measures were properly maintained. Even a simple gesture, like checking the availability of life vests on a boat tour, became both an act of self-preservation and a nod to a collective commitment. Through such actions, the tragedy's legacy lived on, woven into the very fabric of how people conducted themselves, whether traveling, studying, or simply gathering with friends. Despite these ongoing efforts, an undercurrent of unresolved questions and anxieties remained. Could the hard-earned lessons of the ferry disaster truly stand the test of time, safeguarding future generations from similar horrors? Or would the passage of years inevitably erode public resolve, leaving space for complacency and complacent attitudes to resurface? Though no one could predict the future with certainty, the earnest dedication of survivors, families, and countless engaged citizens offer a measure of hope. Their collective determination formed the final bulwark against forgetting, ensuring that the tragedy's warnings and teachings would continue to shape both institutions and individual actions for decades to come. The ferry tragedy's enduring influence extended into spheres that, at first glance, seemed only tangentially related to maritime travel. Educational programs on ethics and leadership drew on the disaster as a key example of how chain-of-command failures, lack of transparency, and complacency could lead to devastating consequences. Students aspiring to become engineers, managers, or policymakers were taught to consider not only technical details, but also the moral implications of their decisions. They learned how a series of minor oversights, overloading cargo, neglecting maintenance, ignoring safety drills, could combine to produce a major catastrophe. Business schools incorporated case studies of the ferry incident into their curricula on corporate social responsibility. Professors highlighted how a relentless pursuit of profit and an internal culture discouraging dissent had played a role in the ship's unsafe condition. As part of their assignments, students debated whether company executives should face criminal charges for decisions made under economic pressure. These discussions often touched on broader questions. How far should accountability stretch within a corporate hierarchy? And what obligations do businesses owe to society at large beyond delivering returns? Meanwhile, in the public health domain, experts noted parallels between maritime disasters and other large-scale crises, such as epidemics. They observed that timely information, swift action, and clear communication channels were vital in both contexts. Some health officials used lessons from the ferry disaster to streamline their own emergency protocols, ensuring that hospitals and community health centers were prepared for sudden surges of critical cases. Conferences on disaster preparedness became increasingly interdisciplinary, with attendees from seemingly unrelated fields, marine engineering, epidemiology, city planning, exchanging insights on the shared principles of effective crisis management. Civic groups continued championing transparency as a cornerstone of prevention. They pressed for more detailed public records on how funds allocated for safety reforms were being spent. With the new inspection programs adequately staffed, with the promised upgrades to rescue equipment actually in place, leaders in these organizations believe that only through open data and ongoing public scrutiny could they confirm that reforms were not merely symbolic. In response, certain government agencies instituted online dashboards where citizens could track progress on safety initiatives, from ferry inspections to the installation of safety barriers at crowded public events. Public awareness campaigns also targeted travelers themselves, urging them to stay informed and proactive. Pamphlets and websites advised passengers on what to check when boarding a vessel, whether life vests were visibly stocked, whether crew members offered a safety briefing, whether escape routes were clearly marked. The campaigns emphasized that individual alertness complemented official oversight, creating a dual safeguard. By embedding these messages into popular media, brief segments on morning talk shows, short animations streamed on social platforms, advocates reached people who might otherwise have tuned out a more formal approach. Though much had changed, the emotional currents running through society were complex. Some felt that the country had come a long way, transforming the ferry disaster into a catalyst for meaningful reform. Others believed that deep-seated cultural patterns, such as deference to authority and the prioritizing of financial efficiency, remained stubbornly resistant to change. Occasional flare-ups of public frustration underscored this lingering divide. For instance, when a report surfaced about a regional ferry operating with outdated safety equipment, heated debates on social media erupted immediately. People demanded immediate punitive action against those responsible, citing the ferry disaster as proof that any carelessness was intolerable. Memorial events, likewise, continued to be a nuanced blend of commemoration and forward-looking resolve. Ceremonies sometimes featured testimonies from officials who had overseen recent safety reforms, giving them an opportunity to demonstrate accountability. On the same stage, survivors or bereaved family members recounted their personal journeys, their voices resonating with raw emotion. Often, the most powerful moments arose from unexpected interactions. An official pausing to comfort a grieving parent, or a young audience member standing to share how the fairy story had inspired them to volunteer for community emergency training. These instances of empathy and unity reinforced the sense that healing was an ongoing, collective endeavor. At the same time, philosophers and social critics continued to analyze the broader lessons of the tragedy. They wrote essays on how a societal fixation on speed, productivity, and hierarchy could overshadow the ethical imperative to protect human life above all else. Some works were academic in tone, dissecting structural inequalities that rendered certain voices, particularly those lower in organizational ranks, silent or unheard. Others were impassioned editorials in mainstream newspapers, reminding readers that no nation is immune to calamity when corners are cut and warnings are dismissed. In this ongoing process, the fairy disaster retained its dual nature. It was both a profound sorrow etched into national memory and a dynamic impetus for reform, strengthened by each new reflection, debate, or policy update. The country pressed forward, continually revisiting the guiding question that emerged in the wake of the tragedy. How can we, as a society, ensure that the mistakes of the past never again conspire to rob us of precious lives and futures? The collective pursuit of that answer persisted, sustained by deep-seated determination and the solemn recollection of what had once been lost. A sense of caution and responsibility continued to pervade public life, bearing echoes of the fairy disaster. As new infrastructure projects broke ground, ranging from bridges to subway extensions, construction firms faced stricter regulations and more frequent inspections. Oversight committees, composed of engineers and community representatives, convened to debate potential risks and ensure that lessons drawn from previous failures were not overlooked. In some respects, the memory of the tragic sinking had broadened into a far-reaching ethos that demanded diligence from everyone involved in shaping the built environment. At the same time, families forever changed by the fairy sinking found themselves in different emotional stages. Some had managed to channel their grief into influential advocacy work, helping to strengthen passenger safety laws or improve crisis response protocols. Others, however, struggled to move forward. They felt burdened by the sense that, despite improvements, no system could ever offer a true guarantee against future calamities. Periodically, these families convened in private support circles where they could safely share memories and regrets. In such intimate settings, the fairy disaster was far more than a point of civic discourse. It was a deeply personal loss that would never be fully remedied by external reforms. Meanwhile, government agencies refined their strategies for preventing large-scale accidents, taking cues from the fairy disaster's aftermath. Officials adopted an integrated framework to track warning signals, ranging from technical malfunctions to financial anomalies in companies that operated public services. Algorithms evaluated patterns indicating that a firm might be skipping maintenance or cutting corners on safety gear. Though critics cautioned that technology alone could not replace conscientious leadership, supporters saw these efforts as another layer of protection. They argued that even a flawed system might have saved lives if it had been in place before the ferry embarked on its ill-fated voyage. Journalists played a crucial role in disseminating updates on these precautionary measures. News segments and investigative programs outlined how changes were being implemented, spotlighting both success stories and lingering gaps. In-depth profiles featured officials championing a culture of prevention, as well as whistleblowers who had risked their careers to report neglected protocols. Public response varied. Some applauded the transparency, while others worried about potential scapegoating of minor figures rather than confronting deeper structural issues. Still, the very fact that such discussions remained in circulation spoke to an enduring collective resolve not to slip back into complacency. That on college campuses, seminars addressing disaster psychology became popular electives. Students pursuing counseling or social work degrees examined how prolonged trauma could influence entire communities, drawing parallels between maritime accidents, natural disasters, and other large-scale crises. These courses underscored the importance of mental health services, both for direct survivors and for the wider circle of individuals impacted by harrowing events. Professors encouraged their students to build compassionate listening skills, emphasizing that emotional support was as vital to recovery as any material or procedural fix. Outside academic settings, volunteer groups continued practicing emergency drills in local neighborhoods. They met on weekends to simulate scenarios of flooding, transport mishaps, or building evacuations, operating under the premise that readiness depended on constant repetition and engagement. Over time, these drills fostered tight-knit bonds among participants, creating informal networks that could mobilize swiftly in a genuine crisis. Many volunteers acknowledged the ferry disaster as their reason for joining in the first place, feeling compelled to be part of a proactive solution rather than mere onlookers. Amid these forward-looking actions, annual memorial services retained a deeply emotional core. Parents revisited the site where tributes and photographs had been placed, noticing how weather and time had begun to wear at certain displays. Volunteers replaced faded images or re-laminated handwritten notes to keep them legible. The act of tending to these relics was both loving and sobering, reminding onlookers that memory alone was insufficient without sustained commitment to safety. By preserving each photograph and message, they preserved the call to vigilance, anchoring progress in the tangible traces of what had been lost. Reflecting on the nation's trajectory, community leaders often invoked the ferry disaster as a defining moment that continued to reshape attitudes about duty and care. They highlighted the many areas where progress was evident: expanded training, clearer regulations, and greater public engagement. Yet they also acknowledged persistent struggles, bureaucratic inertia, budget constraints, and the human tendency to grow lax when immediate danger receded. That tension underscored the complexity of safeguarding lives in a rapidly evolving society. Each time a potential hazard was flagged, the collective memory of the ferry crisis spurred renewed efforts to fix problems before they spiraled. In this interplay between mourning and reform, a cautious optimism emerged. The raw sorrow of the ferry's sinking had, over time, catalyzed a more mindful culture. Though no set of laws or protocols could promise absolute security, the principles forged in the tragedy's aftermath continued to guide daily decisions and institutional policies. Through such vigilance, maintained by families, officials, and ordinary citizens, the ferry disaster's heartbreaking legacy found a transformative purpose, ensuring that its lessons remained woven into the fabric of the future. In subsequent years, the social fabric continued to adapt, weaving the memory of the ferry disaster into a broader narrative of collective responsibility. Students, whether in primary school or university, grew increasingly accustomed to discussing real-life events in the classroom. Teachers introduced projects that required young people to research safety failures in historical contexts, such as mining accidents, collapsed buildings, or major traffic catastrophes, and compare them to the lessons gleaned from the ferry tragedy. Through these assignments, a culture of inquiry was fostered. The goal was not merely to recount facts, but to understand how systemic negligence and a lack of critical thinking could jeopardize lives that in parallel. Certain legislators took innovative steps to ensure that the principles of accountability remained embedded in governmental structures. They drafted bills that mandated routine emergency simulations for all branches of public service, from city halls to postal services. On set days, employees had to practice responding to simulated crises, including floods, earthquakes, and transport incidents. Though some officials grumbled about the added workload, many recognized the long-term value. A well-prepared public sector was less likely to repeat the chaotic missteps witnessed during the ferry sinking. These drills also encouraged interdepartmental cooperation, highlighting how emergencies demanded swift coordination rather than bureaucratic siloing. Beyond public agencies, private enterprises found themselves subject to renewed scrutiny whenever they handled large numbers of passengers or hazardous materials. Passenger bus companies introduced revised checklists to verify vehicle conditions before departure, while cargo shipping firms faced more frequent spot inspections. In the aviation industry, airline safety announcements became noticeably more detailed, with flight attendants urging travelers to pay attention and know their exit routes. In each of these areas, the ferry disaster served as a somber reminder that the stakes for neglect were far too high. Meanwhile, nonprofits collaborated to develop specialized training materials for schools. These resources included real-life testimonies from survivors who described how they had coped with fear and confusion when the ferry started listing. The stories were not sensationalized. They conveyed the practical realities of trying to move through tilting hallways or searching for life vests in disorienting conditions. Counselors contributed sections on emotional resilience, explaining that panic often escalates when people feel powerless. By sharing these firsthand accounts, educators hope to instill both empathy and preparedness in the next generation. Of course, reminders of pain remain palpable. Families who had lost loved ones occasionally voiced frustration that certain promises of reform still felt underrealized. They insisted on continued transparency in the funding of safety projects, fearing that good intentions could fade if new political leaders prioritized other agendas. In televised interviews, spokespersons for these families urged the public not to settle for partial measures, emphasizing that genuine transformation required constant vigilance. The memory of standing by shoreline, hoping desperately for rescued children who never appeared, still burned vividly in their minds. Responding to such appeals, local community centers organized Remember and Act evenings, where citizens gathered to watch short documentaries about the ferry incident and then participated in discussions about ongoing reforms. These events welcomed multi-generational attendance. Grandparents who had once known a world without advanced technology sat beside teenagers adept at navigating digital tools. The dialogue spanned both the raw grief of the past and the tangible steps needed to avert future calamities. It was not unusual to see tears in the eyes of older participants as they recounted the day the news first broke, nor was it surprising to hear determined voices among younger attendees, declaring that passivity would no longer be an option. From a distance, observers from other nations continued to praise this sustained focus on safety, contrasting it with instances where major disasters had prompted only fleeting introspection. Some researchers wrote articles suggesting that the ferry's legacy had shaped the country's collective psyche more powerfully than anticipated. They noted the way it permeated discussions from urban planning commissions to family dinner tables, acting as a guiding compass for ethical policy making and personal responsibility alike. At international conferences on risk management, delegates often cited the ferry as an example of how a single catastrophe could trigger a national overhaul of priorities. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of this shift was the annual youth forum held in the capital each spring. Students from across the nation submitted essays on how best to preserve lives in times of crisis, with the winning entries presented at a ceremony attended by civic leaders, families of victims, and interested citizens. In each heartfelt proposal, ranging from improved engineering designs to simpler communication protocols, the imprint of the ferry disaster was unmistakable. In the stillness following every speech, the same quiet vow echoed. Never again would complacency be allowed to overshadow the value of human life. Gradually, the ferry disaster settled into the realm of living history, serving as a constant reference point for how a society's compassion and diligence could be rekindled by collective sorrow. On each anniversary of the sinking, crowds gathered at memorial sites to offer flowers, letters, or simply a moment of silence. Families of the deceased arrived with careful steps, some visibly weary from years of grief, others quietly determined to share their ongoing message of caution and empathy. The memorial walls, lined with photos and poems, have become places for both mourning and resolve, a physical testament to tragedy and an enduring beacon of social responsibility. Meanwhile, many who had been children during the disaster were now moving into adulthood, shaped by the values that permeated their education. Some enrolled in academic programs focused on humanitarian aid, disaster management, or psychology, hoping to build careers that would prevent or at least mitigate future catastrophes. Others found themselves speaking at community events, recounting how the tragedy had led them to see the world differently, to notice small oversights and raise alarms when something felt unsafe. Through their experiences, they epitomized how a single defining event can recalibrate a generation's outlook. Cultural reflections on the ferry persisted as well. Authors continued writing novels that explored the moral complexities of crisis, while playwrights staged productions inspired by interviews with survivors and rescue workers. Museums set aside permanent exhibits that chronicled the chain of bureaucratic failures and highlighted personal stories of hope and despair. Although some visitors found these displays emotionally draining, they often left with a renewed appreciation for the fragile nature of everyday life and the profound consequences when warning signs go unheeded. Over time, smaller tragedies still happened. An overturned fishing boat, a minor industrial accident, and in the aftermath of each, commentators drew parallels to the ferry sinking. They analyzed whether response protocols had improved and whether oversight structures proved robust. In most instances, thanks to the reforms that had been gradually implemented, rescue efforts were more efficient and accountability was more transparent. Yet each fresh incident also reminded the country that safety is a continuum, never perfected, always in need of reevaluation and care. In the economic realm, companies that consistently demonstrated rigorous safety standards found their reputations bolstered, attracting customers who placed a premium on well-managed operations. Insurers offered discounted premiums to businesses that passed comprehensive safety audits, incentivizing them to maintain high levels of compliance. Over time, this subtle shift in market dynamics helped normalize the idea that safety investments were not optional add-ons, but integral components of ethical, profitable enterprises. Even smaller firms, once hesitant to incur the costs of new equipment or training, recognized the potential gains from aligning themselves with the public's deep-rooted insistence on vigilance. Perhaps the most profound indication of lasting change lay in the way people spoke about responsibility. Where older generations might have glossed over uncomfortable questions, younger citizens increasingly expected clarity about evacuation procedures, staff qualifications, and government enforcement. They saw their participation in public hearings or volunteer training sessions not as burdens, but as intrinsic elements of a healthy social contract. In the hearts of many, the tragedy had illuminated how easily a lack of preparedness could shift an ordinary day into irreparable loss. This lesson, transmitted through oral histories and institutional reforms, resonated across multiple domains. Workplaces, classrooms, households. That on a symbolic note, the final salvage pieces of the ferry itself were moved to a specially designated memorial park. There, parts of the battered hull stood as a tangible reminder of the ship's final moments. A massive structure both haunting and instructive. Guided tours took visitors past plaques describing engineering flaws and organizational lapses, culminating in a reflective space that honored each passenger and crew member. Visitors often emerged subdued, yet resolute, aware that the ferry's silhouette embodied not only a national sorrow, but also the formidable power of collective determination. Indeed, in the end, the ferry disaster had wrought a transformation whose impact was measured not by a single policy or monument, but by 1,000 subtle adaptations in daily life. It thrived in careful checklists, honest conversations, and mutual respect across hierarchical lines. It informed not just how people traveled, but how they treated one another, reinforcing the principle that every life, no matter how ordinary, merited protection and care. And while no one could claim that perfection had been achieved, the very pursuit of it, motivated by memories of a day when complacency led to heartbreak, was what continued to unify a diverse population under the banner of shared resolve.